Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, Pulitzer Prize winner Emily Nussbaum and her new book, Cue the Sun, The Invention of Reality TV. How much more do I need to say? It's the history of reality TV. Emily's won a Pulitzer Prize because she's awesome at writing. So I'm not going to try and sell it anymore. Let's shut up and get to Emily. And here we are with author Emily Nussbaum. Cue the Sun, The Invention of Reality TV. Emily, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Emily, I've asked this of every Pulitzer winner that has been on here. When you found out you won, how huge was that party? Now, are you kind of, go to a winery type of thing, or did you have like keggers in the backyard? How did you celebrate?
There is no downside to winning a Pulitzer. Also, I didn't know I was up for a Pulitzer. The whole thing was a complete surprise. My boss called me and told me, and I almost thought he was joking because it was wonderful. I did not throw a kegger. I did go to I went and had a swanky cocktail in Midtown with my husband and my father, and it was really fun. But the actual Pulitzers themselves were great. I remember when I was there with my husband, I was like, wow, there are a lot of, look, there's nothing to complain about. Like, I obviously have a wonderful career, but there are situations that are stressful. And that was just dress up, win a fancy prize, eat a fancy dinner, and meet cool people. So it was exciting. And I think it was the 100th year of the Pulitzers at the time. So they actually did sort of a whole rigmarole.
So a party on top of a party.
Yeah.
And now you write about TV a lot, but this book is on reality TV. I loved it. What made you decide that this was the next book was to focus entirely on the history of reality TV?
Well, one thing about this book, and I talk about this a little bit at the beginning, is that I initially thought about writing this book in 2003, before actually I was a television critic, at a time that I was a freelance writer, and I was just thinking with a bunch of friends about possible book ideas. And it was right at the beginning of the turn of the century reality boom. And I'd watched a shocking amount of The Real World. And I had also gotten into the first season of Big Brother, which was streaming online, which was a radical, nerdy, weird, new thing. I mean, the internet was very young, and I was streaming streams from the Big Brother house into the corner of my screen. So in order to justify this extremely embarrassing habit, I had this idea that I would go to LA and write a nonfiction book about the reality TV boom, basically. And I told this to a friend of mine, and he said very snottily, "You better write that fast." And the idea was, this is a fad. If you try to write a book about this, it will be gone by the time it's published. And I sort of listened to him on that. But 20 years later, obviously he was wrong. It was not a fad. But by the time I got around to writing it, reality television was an established industry. And I pitched it as part of a 2-book deal that I made, where I first published an anthology of my criticism, and they wanted a nonfiction book as well. So this was an old idea that I repitched. And at the time I repitched it, honestly, I did not know how far it would go back. And I think I thought what I thought around 2003, which is that it probably went back to The Real World in 1992. But once I started researching, I realized how deep the roots of the genre were. And as for the question of why I wanted to write about it, I wanted to write about it because whether people love or hate reality TV, and I've talked to many people who it's a very divided response to the subject of the book, there's no denying its importance. And it's a really uncovered story. And this is an origin story. It's not criticism. It's a nonfiction reported book where I did like 300 interviews with people. And, it's about essentially where this came from and how it moved to the center of the culture to the point that it affected people's personal relationships, their sense of identity. It elected a president. And it's about the early part of that story. It runs from 1947 to around 2009. So it traces the creation of the reality genre.
And I have to say, I am on the other side. I hate reality TV. Unless Gordon Ramsay is in it, then it should win an Emmy. All other reality TV is terrible. But I love the book because, like you said, you go at this as a historian as opposed to just a TV critic, like The Real World is good or bad or anything like that. I do want to ask, it's a hacky question, but I got to ask it.
It's okay.
What is your favorite reality show of all time? You have to pick one.
Let me think about it. In a lot of ways, I have a lot of sentimentality about the first season of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, because I remember being very excited about that. And honestly, my favorite one is probably, and this is an obvious answer that a lot of people have, but it's actually the third season of The Real World with Pedro Zamora. I think that was a very powerful version of reality television that both told a great story and had fantastic characters who were somewhat self-aware people who had enormous charisma. I mean, there were things that I just love about that. But part of that is my age. Like, I'm a Gen X person. Of course, I'm going to like the real world. And while I've been talking about this book, it's really fascinating. It really depends who somebody is. What is the show that is meaningful to them? But also, the weird thing about it is, as you were saying, this is a history book and it's not a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of book. Most of the shows that I write about, I have extremely mixed feelings about. I think they're important. I think they have impact. I think they're powerful. And sometimes I think they're sleazy. I think they're unethical. And I think they caused harm. Like, you can believe that something is important and powerful, and there are reasons people watched it, and also feel critical feelings. And you literally can't think about reality TV without thinking of it that way, because the shows are defined by this kind of cognitive dissonance of how the audience feels, how it's made, all of that kind of thing. So you're certainly not alone in disliking reality TV. But, I hope that the book is useful on that front as well, because it's essentially like, how did we get here in a negative sense?
I mean, I think I'm an elder millennial. I think that's maybe the term. But I remember Real World Season 3 was that's when I became aware of this type of TV. And it was so different. It was so new. But you already said it. You wouldn't actually call it the very first one. Reality TV has its roots all the way back in post-World War II, right?
Yeah, and this was the big surprise to me in doing my initial research, was I knew I wanted to write about Candid Camera. Most people are familiar with Candid Camera, and a lot of people are very sentimental about Candid Camera. They feel like, oh, that was the old-fashioned prank show with Alan Funt. The thing is, Candid Camera started as a radio show called Candid Microphone. And it was, at the time, it was part of a big boom of shows that put regular people on radio, which was at the time the dominant medium that everybody listened to. And, radio had lots of fancy scripted shows, comedies and dramas. And suddenly there was this set of shows that took ordinary people and had them make fools of themselves or tell personal stories, compete for prizes by spilling the beans on stuff in their families. Candid Microphone came out around that time. And it was actually sort of a edgy, iconoclastic version of these audience participation shows that was a little more dark and intellectual, a prank show that surprised people. But it was only one of many shows. And I'll go back to Candid Microphone and Candid Camera in a second. But these shows, the audience participation shows, and this is what was a real shock to me, they provoked exactly the same response from critics and audiences that, say, Survivor did in 2000. There was this boom in reality at the turn of the century. And I think, like many people around that time, I saw it as a modern art form. And actually, in the 40s, people had the same responses. They were like, what is this? Who are these people? Why would they go on the air? What does this say about the American culture? Does it show that people are narcissists? A lot of people found these shows tacky. They were very cheap. They were a way not to pay writers and actors. It was a real threat to the industry. But at the same time, people were incredibly titillated and fascinated by the ability to see regular people like themselves. So these qualities, the excitement, the high ratings, the cheapness, the ability to put regular people on the air, the huge audience eager to see these people, and the simultaneous moral panic that it provoked, that's the shape of reality television. And it repeats over and over again throughout the history of it. So that big boom in the late 40s that led on to live TV once television started was the first round of this loop that would happen, where people would put inexpensive shows on the air featuring regular people breaking taboos and saying embarrassing things. Audiences would embrace them, critics would erupt, and then onlookers who were disturbed by the entire spectacle would say, this is just a fad, it's going to go away soon. And sometimes it would fade, but it would always come back. And that pretty much went on until the turn of the century when Survivor came out. And after that, the gates opened and reality TV never went away again.
Where it started was shocking, but I have to focus. My favorite chapter is on a show called An American Family. It could have been its own book. It was riveting. I never heard of it because I think for Candid Microphone, Candid Camera, some of the ones early in the book, people would say, oh, well, it wasn't like a show. It was just people in these segments. But An American Family is way before anything like The Real World. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I had never heard about this in my entire life.
Okay. An American Family, look, it's my favorite chapter in the book too, and I think it's a fascinating show and a fascinating story. It was filmed in 1971. It came out in 1973. It was a series on PBS. It was filmed as in certain ways, a cinema verite documentary. And the people who created it had a very highbrow idea of, we're creating this documentary series that's going to be about this family. It was about an affluent family in Santa Barbara, California, named the Louds. The parents were Bill and Pat Loud, and they had 5 children. And basically for 7 months they were filmed, and there were 12 episodes of the show. When it went on the air, it created an enormous response from the audience, from critics, a moral panic, a lot of disapproval. In the book, I say, it was filmed as a documentary, but when it came out, it was received as a reality TV show. And the Louds became really the first reality stars. They were famous for being famous. People judged them for having been on the show. And it broke taboos in a very new way. The parents, Pat asked Bill for a divorce on camera, and that was aired. Lance Loud, the oldest son in the family, was a tremendously charismatic, fascinating guy, was an artist, and he was gay, and he was visibly gay in the show in a way that people understood and recognized. And that was a complete shock for 1973. But you're right. Unlike a lot of the earlier shows that were merging documentary with game shows or were prank shows, had a different structure, this was, for a lot of people, like a real life soap opera. I have to say, if anybody's watched it, because it's not easily available, it doesn't look a lot like modern reality soap operas. Like, it's a very dreamy, cinema verite, flowing, like almost avant-garde feeling show. But the subject that it covered, which was people's intimate family relationships during a very tense period in the 70s, was so startling to people that honestly, it might as well have been Dallas. It was riveting to people. And it also had an enormous influence, not only on the population, but on the people who later went on to make reality TV, one of whom was John Murray, who watched it when he was 17 and then went on to create The Real World. And The Real World really was the step after An American Family. It was another version of the documentary soap opera made of real life. And there are many different versions of this. But, I love that chapter because the Louds, who are still alive, generously spoke to me. So did Alan and Susan Raymond, who filmed the show. And those two parties are very much at odds. They used to be close. They don't speak anymore. And a lot of that, telling that story, was about taking a very delicate, complex, painful story. It's about a very important show, but one that actually caused a lot of suffering to the people who were on it and the people who made it as well. And telling stories that not everybody agrees on. I mean, this sort of runs through the book, and it's kind of the nature of journalism, of documentary, and somewhat of reality TV is, oftentimes there's a story and people remember it differently. Honestly, it's a show that people should know about because it had an enormous influence, some of it a positive influence. It's a lost part of TV history that I feel that once you know it, it kind of fills in a lot of connective gaps that explain where we got to where we are today.
I mean, it really does. I can't believe how little is remembered about it because I remember you had Pedro. I remember Puck from The Real World. Like these people who, because they were, different for whatever reason, whether sexuality or just kind of crazy, something like that. We remember their names because of The Real World. But for An American Family, I mean, I remember The Real World coming out. It was a big thing that there was a gay character on the show. But I mean, Lance Loud is 30 years before that. And somehow, do you think there's a reason American Family just didn't quite catch on? Was it just, there was no video? What?
Well, I don't think it's that it didn't catch on because certainly people who are the age that watched it when it came out remember it vividly. And Lance Loud was an enormous celebrity. Like he was very, very famous. And the whole family after the show came out, they were upset about what had happened. So they kept doing more and more media to try to tell their side of the story, which was not exactly the most effective approach because people who were already criticizing them for appearing on PBS were then like, wait, now why are they on talk shows? Like there was just criticism of them for being public. So at the time, they were very known, and people who are a little older than me remember the show vividly. The reason it's not remembered is a very simple technological reason, and also, I think, a complicated reason having to do with PBS or WNET. It was in the midst of rebranding at the time. Even though this was a huge hit for that network, a public network, it was also an embarrassment for them. And they never really bragged about it, that it was not put out. Like, even as technology changed and a lot of older TV became available, like, you can't find it on tape, on DVD, on streaming. I think maybe because it was a big anniversary this year, they might have put it out on DVD. I think there was also a music rights issue for the show, but I've heard that several times, and that might be true, but it seems hard for me to believe that something as significant as this show was not available surely because of music rights. Maybe that's naive. They showed it as like a marathon twice, maybe 3 times. And, there have been numerous like panels on it and stuff. But honestly, for me to see it, the Louds gave me their copies.
Well, I think you already blew some of the younger listeners' minds with the fact that not all TV is available online somewhere. For some of us of a certain age back in the day, if you missed an episode of something, you missed it. It was gone, and there was nothing you could do about it. I want to jump to the real world because I think this is another mind-blowing thought process. At the beginning of, the reality TV that we know, real world and stuff like that, there was a real push about authenticity. And that what was happening needed to happen naturally. A lot of people felt very strongly about that. Was that something that stayed around in reality TV for a long time? Was it just an idea that nobody ever really took seriously? How did authenticity in reality TV start, and when did it die?
The way I talk about reality TV in this book is I call it dirty documentary. And what I basically describe it as is when somebody takes what people think of as the highbrow discipline of cinema verite documentary, which is just when you take a camera and you just are patient and watch, and eventually the truth will emerge. That's the sort of purest version of cinema verite. And then you mix it up with something more commercial, more serialized that you can show on TV, that's a format that you can repeat again and again, and that puts pressure on the people inside it. And this can be a game show, it can be a soap opera, it can be a real combination of things like on Survivor. But the goal is that you have real people, and they're having authentic reactions, but the authentic reactions are happening under some kind of complicated outside pressure, and the cameras are there to capture them. And so this is a large genre. There are many, many different versions of this. But I will say that the freak out over authenticity that happened on the first season of The Real World was unlike anything else that happened in reality TV. There are many shows where people were concerned about wanting things to be real, or alternately about wanting things to be dramatic and doing that by any means necessary, including deceptive editing. But The Real World, because of when it was made in the early 90s, was very much a pure Gen X show. And that was not only true of the cast of the first season of The Real World, like, Julie and Kevin and Heather and like that whole crew that if you watch the show, the people, but also the crew of the show, who were a bunch of young MTV employees who weren't that much older than the cast, and were also very concerned about the purity of the experiment that they were doing and about not messing with it. And there was a big debate that broke out on that show between the show's creators, John Murray and Mary Ellis Bunham, and the cast and the crew about what Mary Ellis Bunham wanted to do, which she called throwing pebbles in the pond, which is basically doing small disruptions, like sending somebody out on a fake date, or putting a book that had a sexy picture of Eric Nees was the model on the show, the hot guy on the show. And he had appeared in a nude photo. And so they put the book with the photo in the room to try to get a reaction. When the cast and the crew realized what they were doing, people were outraged. And I at one point, I talk about this as a philosophy as outdated as the Shakers. It was a very pure notion of you can't do anything to manipulate people. We are just trying to capture the truth. And in one way, there's something very beautiful about that, but it was extremely short-lived. And after this rebellion on the part of the cast, which I have to say, to her credit, the executive from MTV ended up taking the side of the cast. And she said, there can't be that much producer intervention into the show. I think that changed a lot on The Real World, and then Road Rules, and then The Challenge over time. But it did establish this initial idea of, however contrived the setting is, it can't be scripted, but also it can't be totally manipulated. I mean, I don't want to be naive about this. I mean, many, many shows have enormous amounts of manipulation. But I have to say, when you investigate that little moment on The Real World, I think that it's just one of those very pure things that pure things that kind of resonates with the larger history of debates over how much you're allowed to interfere and how much you're allowed to fake things. And, in more recent years, I think people understand that a lot of reality is essentially a collaboration between cast and crew where they're faking and acting out sort of soap opera-y plots, and that's true. But I will say the origins of the genre are not necessarily in people scripting their own conflicts. It is somewhat in people capturing conflicts. The cast rebelling against the crew did not just happen on The Real World. It happened again and again on the shows that I write about in the book. And I think it's one of the most interesting parts of the story is I think this tension between the cast that feels controlled by the field producers and the cameramen and the show creators. And the whole thing is always sort of a collaboration between both sides that the viewers can't see one side of it. They can only see the cast. But yeah, there are several other shows, and we could talk about that, where the cast almost stopped the show. That happened on Big Brother, happened in a different way on Survivor. There are all these attempts for casts to sort of organize against the crew and sometimes actually change the rules as they're being made. And I think it's one of the more interesting parts of the story. And more recently, this goes way beyond the book, but I just wrote this piece about Love is Blind, the dating show. And that was more about the labor issues and about the legal issues on reality TV. But this is a more recent thing, but I feel like this is this comes out of that past history of reality cast members trying to organize against crews. There's actually a real attempt to create some sort of unionization or other kind of solidarity among reality cast members. And I think it's a long time coming. And I think it's worth looking at the history of the genre to understand how meaningful that is, because it's a vulnerable group of people, however much people may want to judge them.
I mean, it really takes me back to the 90s, something that I forgot about, that notion of selling out. That if you did something commercial back in the day, if you ever heard like a famous artist and their song was in a commercial, you're like, they sold out, man. We can't ever listen to them again. And it goes along with what they're saying, like, this is an experiment. We're doing something here. You can't mess with it. The 90s were just kind of that time where you don't think about it at all now.
I mean, look, this is very much my age range, and I really understand this stuff, but you're right. Some of it's beautiful, some of it's naive. Like, this is very much the period when I came up, is this fetish for authenticity that's both a legitimate resistance against commercial forces and kind of a weird dead end where anything you do to make a living just shows that you're a sellout. But I have to say, when you watch the first season of The Real World, the amount of conversations between the characters about whether people are selling out is honestly sweet and hilarious. And Julie from The Real World, a lot of the cast members from that first season genuinely, like, they knew they were making a documentary about young artists in New York, and they knew that it was going to be on MTV, which was a big deal, but they really didn't know what the show was going to be. They didn't understand how it was going to be edited. I mean, it was a really new thing. And so in the context of the show, some of the main conversations end up being people accusing one another of being insufficiently real and saying, like, you're just being a phony for money and you're just trying to sell things. But the crazy thing is, I watched the pilot of The Real World, which was actually filmed like a year and a half before The Real World filmed. And it was just filmed over 3 days, and it was a totally different cast. And in the pilot of The Real World, they're also talking about selling out. Like, it's like a rock musician and a sort of experimental rap artist having a conversation where he's saying that the hair metal rock guy, you just want to get a record deal. I will say, young people watching this must be like, what are you talking about? Because it's like, now it's the era of influencers, people who go on reality TV. A large part of their motive is to like brand themselves and unite with another brand. I feel a whole range of ways about this, but it's definitely very different. Oh, the thing I was going to say about Julie was Julie told me that they were so innocent of those kinds of forces that even though I think Levi's sponsored the season and they were all given free Levi's jeans, and they didn't understand that they were supposed to wear them to like award shows because they were supposed to, they were supposed to do product integration, but that was just a very new concept to them, so it never occurred to them. And also they got paid almost nothing. Now there's somewhat more lucrative opportunities.
Any listeners who didn't understand that last question, watch the movie Reality Bites. That should catch you up on everything and you'll understand what we're talking about. I'm going to ask kind of a broad question. I know you deal with it in the book, so I want you to be able to go with it wherever, but we're a lot better about mental health nowadays. I remember as the Real World seasons came on, it seemed to me as a younger person, and I think I already mentioned him, Puck. I saw him and I went, oh, they put him in this show because he's mentally unstable and he was going to make things happen. And then for me, I kind of started to write off reality TV. It's like they're taking these people and not mocking them, but are not in mentally good places. And they're putting them in these stressful environments. And it seemed like what happened is every reality show after that started to play on that, to put these people in here who they knew would explode or do something extreme. Is that just me remembering it that way, or was that actually going on behind the scenes?
That's a really interesting response because first of all, I absolutely agree with the broader thing that you're saying. I think people frequently cast cast members because they're mentally unstable, either mentally ill or vulnerable because of trauma. Like there's a bunch of different ways that someone can be unstable. And they do, before people go on shows, they often go through a psych checkup, and they know every issue a person has. And there's a frequent thing where people talk about where they try to cast somebody who's basically just crazy enough to basically break down on the air, but still be functional enough to actually make the show, or basically be unstable in a way that makes them more likely to make the poor decision to go on to the show in the first place and sort of spill the beans and exhibit their more outrageous qualities, but not self-aware enough to recognize that will be dangerous for them. I mean, some of that is really on casting. And I talked to several people in the book, including a cast member from the first season of the American Big Brother cast, she had an undiagnosed mental illness when she went in. There's no way the casting people didn't know that. It caused her to have an incredible breakdown that was totally traumatic, absolutely publicized. I watched it. It was live on the show, harvested for drama, and then she was essentially abandoned. Her story, she's not alone in that. But it's funny that you brought up Puck because, to use the technical term, Puck was clearly very fucked up. But I'm not sure that what was happening was that they were casting someone who was vulnerable or mentally ill. Puck was a shit-stirring narcissist. He may have had other diagnosable issues, and I don't want to diagnose things or talk about various problems he might have had. But one thing I do feel about him is that he consciously chose to go on the show because he knew that it would be a platform on which he could be a colorful troublemaker. And honestly, just like Pedro Zamora, he knew that the choice to go on the show would make him famous, and he wanted to be famous in that way. I don't think that worked out very well for him in the long run, but there is a point at which it's like, when is the show responsible for letting someone go on the air? And when does somebody get to make that choice for themselves? I think it's a tricky thing. I will say that, and this sounds callous, but Puck's presence on the show, George Verschure, who was the showrunner that season, and who was an initial very important producer on that show. From his perspective, that season of television would not have been good if it was just Pedro doing good things and being lovable and wonderful. The show relied on Puck's presence, being one of the first real reality villains. But he felt like both of them were very self-aware of their choice to go on the show. And you can take that or leave it. But there definitely is a kind of person, Lance Loud was one also, who embrace the camera rather than feel like they're abused by it, and who play into the camera. Years later, people would deliberately embrace the villain at it too.
Well, and something else that goes over the top of all of this, right, which it's hard to tell, is that, and you talk about this, very quickly, just like Puck and Pedro and other people, they realize, oh wait, this is a star vehicle for me. That for some people, it started out as this is art, this is what we're doing, and very quickly people started to realize, oh wait, I can make this work for me, I can become a brand, I can do those things. How fast did that happen kind of across the industry, where the people going on these shows realize that, this isn't necessarily art. This is a way for me to get out there and do bigger things with it?
Well, I'm not sure that many people, other than the Louds, really thought they were making art per se. I definitely think even the very innocent first season of The Real World, they understood that they were going on a documentary on MTV, and they were all artists. So they understood that it was some kind of publicity. I'm somebody who, by the way, I feel like there's this divide on reality shows where people talk about, are they there for the right reasons? That was somewhat created by The Bachelor, I think. And I think this is this very brutal calculation where you're going to judge people for going on a television show and wanting to be famous. I think that is absolutely unjustifiable. A person who goes on a dating reality show just because they want to fall in love is already showing poor judgment. Like, it's normal for people to have multiple motives. But it is true that during the period that I'm writing about, even if people wanted to get famous and they hoped for big opportunities, it wasn't very easy to get those things. There wasn't exactly an off-ramp from becoming a reality star to becoming an actual Hollywood star. And a lot of people, including on the shows at the turn of the century after Survivor, when there was a big boom in production, people would flood into Hollywood and they would be famous because they'd been on a reality show, but they didn't have some talent or representation. They were a household name. People recognized them on the street, but they had no money and they had no protection from their fans and their haters. And they had no way to monetize that fame. So the desire to be famous definitely is something that some people felt when they went on TV. Why wouldn't they? They were going to be on TV. But the aftermath is a whole different thing. And it's some of the stories I told in the book were funny to me. Like, I talked to Darva Conger, who was on Who Wants to Marry a Multimillionaire, which was a show on Fox that was essentially sort of a parody of the Miss America pageant, where a guy married a woman he'd never met, which at the time, I believe it was 1999, was an absolutely outrageous idea that has now become bizarrely normalized, where people marry strangers all the time. What's odd about that? But at the time, it was a very shocking thing. And also the show itself, it's a long story, but the show was a huge hit, got big ratings. And then in the aftermath, the guy turned out to have a history of domestic violence, and he'd had a restraining order taken out against him. And that was such bad publicity that it like canceled the show and the people who created it. It was this huge thing. But Darva Conger was the bride for that show. And after she was on the air, she was a laughingstock in the country, and she did a bunch of publicity to try to tell her side of the story. But she also, I think, perfectly sensibly and strategically was like, look, now that I'm famous, I might as well try to make something of it. They gave her an offer to appear on Playboy, which she did, and she got some money from that. But she also tried to create a website, like a lifestyle website that had her interest in gardening and cooking and fashion. And this was in 1999. And all I can say is that there was no success to her attempt to create this, but it was actually very prescient, right? Because that's what people do all the time now. It was like an early attempt at being an influencer and trying to turn your fame into something that went beyond the show. But until there was actually an infrastructure for that in the form of like Instagram, a lot of people had, I think, stars in their eyes about what was going to happen in the aftermath of the show that were not fulfilled. And that's just like the nature of the beast. There was a long period when there was a real tension in Hollywood between reality stars and real stars, like scripted actors, because they were both in the town. And at this point, I think there's a surprising amount of overlap between those two sides, but not during the period I was writing about, where anybody who worked in reality on either side of the camera was in a marginalized community that was sort of a little dirty, definitely cheaper, and outside of Hollywood glamour.
You just mentioned this too, like NDAs run out. A lot of people are kind of past the point of caring about this, but even as an experienced writer, is this a difficult one to write about? Because when you go to your sources, right, there's, documents and things that you can go to, but when you go to sources, a lot of people in this industry are going to want to put out what they think happened or whatever puts them in the best light. Did you find with a lot of your conversations, you're kind of sitting there going, I'm going to have to check this, I'm going to have to check this? Or were people generally pretty forthright with you about their experiences and what they think happened?
Well, I think people were forthright with me about their perspective on the experience. I'm sure some people lied to me also. People lie all the time. A lot of times I was dealing with stories where people had different versions of the story. And in that case, I would always try to get everyone's perspective. There's a level at which I can't like legally, so I could figure out what seemed most right. But sometimes there's genuinely, different points of view. It's funny, Grant Loud in the book, he talked to me about how everyone refers to what happened with the Louds as a Rashomon story within the circle of those people. And he was like, it's fine. Like, I have one version of it. The Raymonds remember it differently. But then he made this other point where he said, at a certain point, I actually saw Rashomon and I realized that everybody thought that was about how everyone has their own version, but it's actually about how everyone's version is about them as the hero. And I do think that's true, is I would talk to people about some of these stories and people remember their own role differently than other people did. But there are also some things where it was just like, it's both frustrating and fun when there's a story that has multiple angles. And I did find there were like crazy things where you just need to hear everyone's point of view. Like there was this weird thing that happened in the first season of Survivor where Richard Hatch, who ultimately won the show, was in the final rounds of it, and they were all genuinely, legitimately, in a non-contrived way, starving, in a way that they often didn't on later seasons of Survivor, because as several people pointed out, it doesn't actually make great television for people not to be able to move and to be dehydrated and sleeping all the time because they're getting sick. But anyway, they were very hungry, and Richard accused Kelly, who ended up coming in second on the show, of having gotten like a power bar from one of the cameramen. So I really did my best to, I talked to Kelly, I talked to Richard, I talked to the cameraman. I mean, there were a couple of stories like that in the book. I would try my best to tell the story where I set out the multiple angles of it and then let the reader both make up their own mind and also just kind of understand the range of things. That was just one of them, though. I mean, there are a bunch of different things.
What I'm hearing, Emily, is that you probably have a bunch of notebooks with crazy-ass rumors that you can't put out because you get sued, but they'd probably be really interesting to read.
I mean, honestly, I tried to include, I like a book to be interesting, and these are interesting stories. It's part of why I wanted to write about them. I tried to be respectful and sensible, and this is not a tabloid. I wouldn't say that, sometimes I know some things that happened on shows that I didn't put in the book, because at a certain point, it's not super relevant to what happened on the show. Because the bulk of what I wanted to portray in the book had to do with the creation of the reality genre and also with the experiences of the crew members and the cast members as they essentially invented jobs that had never existed before. But some of that was about the relationship between the two sides. So to the extent that I was writing about, colorful stories, a lot of them that I ended up focusing on were stories about those dynamics, which I think are key to understanding the genre, even its modern form. Because, on a scripted show, there's a writer and there are cast members, and they read the lines and they're directed and it's produced and they're edited together. On a reality show, it depends on the show, because obviously they have different formats, but the relationship between a field producer and a cast member is the material that the show creates. It's the behavior that results from that relationship that you see on the show. So in this book, I had the opportunity to describe the relationship, the sort of collaborative, sometimes abusive, sometimes generative and positive sort of improvisation that has to do with both sides of that. And then separately, what the editors do, which is its own thing.
Well, I mean, that's the behind the scenes. And I mean, the book is just, there's so much stuff in it. There's no way we can do it in one podcast. I mean, we didn't even touch on the back end business side of it, where these reality producers and creators are misfits themselves, who a lot of people don't like because they either don't respect them and they're afraid of losing their own spots with scripted TV. That's a crazy story in and of itself, right?
Yeah, it was one of the tricky things about writing the book is a lot of people who created reality television are real rapscallions, kind of piratical, entrepreneurial, zealous figures who are very charismatic and really pushed, like movers and shakers who were willing to manipulate people and were trying to make a bundle. I mean, they were sort of gamblers. And so I neither wanted to sentimentalize them, nor did I want to undermine the fact that they're really interesting people, in complicated ways. But the people who worked on the shows, the field producers, the editors, the camera operators, and a lot of other people, even on shows that I thought had slimy sides, I have a lot of respect for the work that those people do, because it is a very hard job. They work incredible hours for very little pay, and they are craftspeople. And some of the crafts may be things that people disapprove of, including some of the techniques that field producers use. Nonetheless, I wanted to capture the mindset of what it feels like to be shaping the real behavior of your cast in that way. And I didn't want to do it in a kind of just a finger wagging way where I was like, this is a bad thing that happened. I mean, it's just more complicated than that. And some of those people did really creative things. And one thing I tried in this book to do was to give people credit for it when they created an element of reality TV that had some lasting meaning, like the guy that came up with outplay, outlast, like that slogan, or George Verschure on The Real World. I believe it was in the second season of the show that he came up with the confessional, where they created a closet with a camera. Somebody would go in and speak to the camera and sort of give their own diary that would then be used on the show. That's been used multiple times on different shows. And there were sort of creative inventions like that I tried to trace the beginnings of. And in order to do that, you have to understand that the people who were doing these jobs were making their jobs up. They came from other areas. They worked in TV news, or they were travel reporters. They had done a lot of adventure stuff or sports stuff. And certainly a lot of them worked in documentaries. And so when they came into these jobs, they had to create what the jobs are. That's not true anymore. Now it's an actual industry. And when you become a field producer, people mentor you and they tell you how to do those interviews. And when you become an editor, there's a whole background on reality editing. So part of, I think, the value of this story is the period when nobody did know that stuff and when they were actually creating those jobs.
And it's really easy, especially somebody who says they hate reality TV. There's a lot of heartwarming stuff in here, too. Like, it was the queer eye for the straight guy part. It started off, and it seemed like everybody part of it was very sweet and very protective of the people that were going to be on it, and that they really wanted to do something that was very positively driven, while still, fun, and there were fun jokes and everything. But I remember reading that and thinking, oh, like, it's good to know that there was at least one. I'm sure there are many, but that one in particular where you felt like, oh, this was all coming from a good place. It's still a commercial property, but it was coming from somewhere good.
I mean, there are criticisms you can make of that show, the main one being the fact that it was also rife with product integration. It was meant to sell products. And there's a criticism of the show that it was basically like making men as neurotic about getting skin creams and stuff as women always were. Look, I have a very big soft spot for early Queer Eye. I love talking to the people who worked on and created that show. And I'm very much in the camp of Ted, who I talked to, who now is the host of Chopped and is great. And he was the food guy on the show. And he really took issue with a lot of sometimes there would be criticism that would say it was like gay minstrelsy and that it was somehow stereotypes of gay men. And he was like, no, this is a show that celebrates these crafts. Like, there are other shows that make fun of like a gay florist or a fashion guy. And this show treats those as meaningful professions by skilled people. And look, to anybody watching that show, this show was a show about a utopian fantasy in which gay men lived such admirable lives that anybody would want to imitate them. And in that way itself, it was a major breakthrough. And the other thing to understand about Queer Eye is that it was the secret sauce behind what Bravo became, for better or worse, but it was the originating show. It was the show that became a hit. And then when Lauren Zalaznick came on board the network, which had been like a high art network, and then made Queer Eye, she designed the network after the 5 sections of Queer Eye. It was like food, fashion, each of those things. It's also one of those things where I'm sure there are some people, when they watch the jokes from the show, they don't hold up. But talk about authenticity. I mean, there's a level at which the actual joking around, like, none of that was scripted. Carson Kressley was hilarious. The editor from that show was like, he had so many jokes. The hardest part of editing was just coming up with like 5 out of the 50 jokes that he had made. And, it was a fun, spontaneous show. It was meant to uplift people. And I think it did have an impact on people in a lot of ways. And it's different than something like Project Runway or American Idol, which came out slightly earlier, but it was also part of the growth of shows that were reality shows about ballroom dancing, fashion design, like creative arts, and celebrating, elevating, creating fun competitions for, but also, in bold ways, showing people what it's like to be that kind of artist. Unfortunately, that all led to The Apprentice, which tried to do the same thing for marketing, but that's a whole other story.
We're going to save that for people to read that particular chapter. I want to ask a very quick question for you. If you had to go on a reality show right now, which one would it be? I'm assuming you've already mentioned your husband, so Bachelor and Bachelorette is out the door. But you have to go on a reality
show. There are lots of shows that married couples can go to have their marriages screwed up. Like, that's a big section of reality TV. I think we would have many options. Isn't that what Temptation Island is about? I mean,
I don't
there are a bunch
anymore.
of shows out there. I would not go on a dating show. If I was forced to, what kind of nightmare is this? If I was forced to go on a on a reality show. I don't, like, I'm not saying I don't know what reality shows are out there, but I don't know the whole landscape because the book is about older shows and I've watched some recent ones. Honestly, I was once very briefly on I'm not really on the show, but the only time that a situation came up, which I might have been on a reality show, I deliberately did not sign the permission thing that they put on my desk. So I used to work at a magazine called Nerve, which was a magazine about sex and culture, and HBO decided they were going to do a reality show about it, early in the century. And I told everybody at the magazine. I was like, this is really dangerous. Like, I'd been watching Big Brother. I was like, we should not do this. They can do anything they want, and they could definitely make fun of us, and they should. But, it was a commercial opportunity, and they went ahead with it. But I had a thing on my desk, like to sign off to use footage featuring me, and I just did not sign it. I mean, I actually didn't confront them about it. I think I threw it out. It didn't become a series, but there was a one episode on HBO. And I don't know whether it was because I didn't sign it, but I'm not featured in it at all. And there's one shot of me like running down the hallway from the back, which I could tell it's me, but nobody else could. Given that, I think I'm unlikely to say yes to appearing on a show. I mean, it's like a kind of, I know too much situation.
Well, if you're not going to pick, we're just going to put you on Survivor. It's officially you're on Survivor.
Actually, okay. If I was on Survivor, that would be great because I would lose fast and everybody thinks Survivor is really classy now. Like, it's kind of crazy. Like, when Survivor came out, it was very controversial. Everyone was like, what is this degraded show that makes people eat bugs? Like, people were really upset. At this point, Survivor is like this elegant, old-fashioned show that people watch with their children on reruns. It's kind of hilarious. And I have to say, even at the turn of the century, I wrote a piece years ago for a magazine called Radar that was about a bar in LA called Belly that was owned by a Big Brother cast member. And it was about a bar that a lot of reality television people went to. And it was about the reality TV community. And in that piece, I noted that the survivors, even at that point, it was like 2004 or something. There's nothing against the survivors. They're great, but they were very full of themselves. And I talked about how alumni of various reality shows were acted like they were alumni of different college systems. And so they all knew one another. And the survivors clearly regarded themselves as the Ivy Leagues. So, you know something? I would go on an Amazing Race. That's the one universally beloved, heartwarming adventure show. And everyone comes off pretty well, mostly. And I like to travel. And I think Clive and I would be great on that show. That's it. I'm applying. And one of my heroes, Mike White, went on that show and Survivor. So maybe I should take him as a model. He's a wonderful television creator who created White Lotus, among many other excellent things, like The Comeback.
My fiance brought up Amazing Race a couple of times, and I'm like, do you see how it happens when we don't have any stress and we try and go traveling together? Like, no, ma'am, no, sir, not going to happen. We're not going to do it. It's just funny you saying that Survivor's now the classy one. I do remember Survivor was not classy, and then stuff like Joe Millionaire came out, and it's like,
yes.
Okay, got it. Yeah, like this is the
It's
classy
all
one.
about the comparison.
By default.
That's true.
So, Emily, last question for you. We started History Nerds United because some people think history is boring, right? So now people might hear reality TV, but then they hear, history of reality TV. History is a class I took in high school. I don't want to hear about it again. If we put one of those poor misguided souls in front of you and they said, why should I read Q the Sun? What would you say?
It's a good story. Don't you want to read something that's a good story? That's the reason that I wanted to write about it. I knew even before I started the book that there was a lot of untold scuttlebutt and a lot of fascinating, juicy backstories. I think reality television is important. I tried to treat it thoughtfully, but is it a fun subject? Yeah, it is. And I think it's a powerful one, and I think it's one people don't know much about. So I think the reason you should read it is because sometimes you don't know what you don't know. But I think that's true of a lot of history books.
Well, Emily, I hate reality TV, but I absolutely love the book. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful talking to you.
And that's it for this episode. Emily, thank you so much. Q the Sun. Hey, if you love reality TV or you hate it, trust me, this book is for you. Hit us up, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Don't forget to check out YouTube. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.
History Nerds United.